Sufficiency means we can really conclude from the property to the class as necessary. Definition means we can conclude from the class to the property. And we have this Venn diagram which describes right? Each of these ovals is a set, and obviously these sets are overlapping. So we have here the set of all people who have, but the set of everything that has a national insurance number. Nick would be one. And I updated the slides on the wiki, so you can also just download that. And obviously Nick would be one instance of that. And that's said because it is a sufficient definition, is included in the set of persons here in green. Right? So here I try to sort of like do the class definition person in the same color as the circle. And myself, I would be a person who doesn't have a national insurance number. But it's still a person. And persons in general have properties necessary, properties that are not sufficient, like having a birthday or having two parents. And above, I guess, is Hydra one example, which is a certain kind of animal, which actually does not only use sexual reproduction, but also asexual reproduction. So that would be something that one could say has a birthday but not two parents. Okay, so you see that in a way the sufficient properties they explore the class person that we are interested in from the inside. And the necessary ones are like having two parents or having a birthday, they explore it from the outside. Ideally, we can give property definitions that are necessary and sufficient. And as I said last time, for something so complex as a person, that's hardly achievable. We can achieve it for something like a student, because we can describe a student as being a person who is inscribed at a school or some university. So, a person is just like too complex and too complex concept to describe fully. We can still describe the person partially with necessary definitions describing it from the outside or sufficient describing it from the inside without exactly describing the exact boundary of the class definition. While here the student we describe exactly the exact boundary of the class definition, because these two together are really necessary and sufficient. So this is the core way of thinking about the problem. Okay, now in Well, that's something we already have in prescription logic that we also have in R, obviously. Now we have a couple of more interesting constructs that we can use to define things. So I already mentioned last time, if I write a book, then this book has me as an author. Right? So this is a typical example of something, one property being the inverse of another property. So if I give it to a reasoner, and I tell the reasoner I wrote this book on grading knowledge, for example, wrote my PhD thesis, then this book, Grading Knowledge, has me as an author. That's automatically implied. And the other way around. Now we have this example last time already about symmetry. So, we have a sibling, my sister, for example. So my sister has me as a sibling. Again, so that can be automatically inferred by the reasoner. If I just give one direction, I automatically have the other direction. We also have this example of transitivity. I think again that's rather easy. That if I have an ancestor like my mother, and my mother has as an ancestor her mother, then, well, his grandmother, of course, would be also my ancestor, just because of the two relationships of I having as an ancestor my mother, and she has as an ancestor her mother. And of course, I would not stop there, but it would continue as far as we know the ancestor relationship. So that's where we stopped last time. Now, we come to some very important properties that some of you who have database classes spend quite some time thinking about, and they are also needed here. Namely, some of our properties identify ourselves. Right? So when we have, and in two directions. So first, let's talk about the national insurance number. If someone of you has a national insurance number, I guess many will have. How many can you have? Really just one, right? Unless you
for this country, just one.
Yeah, I mean, or unless you cheat and something. So there could probably be exceptions, but in general, the rule should be you have at most one national insurance number. And so that means when I know about your identity, I know, and when I ask twice about your identity and your national insurance number, I must get the same result. Otherwise, something is inconsistent, right? The same is true about your birth date, right? You can only have one birth date. Maybe it's not known, right? Maybe we have some false information. But in reality, you can only have exactly one birth date. Be careful when we talk about this having at most one, because it's different than the other way around. So when we talk about, for example, how should I? Well, we can't do this in the next slide. Just a note here: we might have several means of identification. So you may have a national insurance number, and you may have a passport number, right? Now this is important that in the next slide, when we talk about inverse functional. An inverse functional property basically says that if I have a property and that gives me some value, then this value uniquely determines who you are. There may be actually several such uniquely determining properties. Your national insurance number points exactly to you and to no other person. Your passport number points exactly to you and to no one else if you have one. Maybe your student immatriculation number or something like that points exactly to you and to no one else if you have one. So you may have several identifications. Each of them points exactly to you. This pointing exactly to you means this is an inverse functional property. Why is it called inverse functional? It is functional, but not so like away from the object, but pointing towards the object. And that's also how we use it then. We can use it that if we have two people who have the same national insurance number, they must be the same two people. Right? Maybe I talk once about you using your name, and then I talk about you using your artist name. Or maybe I'm just a bit unaware of what exactly your name is. And then, if I know that these are two entities with the same national insurance number, I need to merge them, and that's what the reasoner will do. So each identification points to only one person. The birth date, for example, is functional. You have exactly one birthday. But obviously, for any given birthday, there are thousands, millions of people who have the same birthday in the world. So these examples here to indicate to you that functional and inverse functional, of course they're related, always mean that from one end to the other, you can only have one result for a given input. But it depends whether you look, let's say, from the person to this property, or from this property to the person. Now, of course, I gave the examples now with persons, but it's not limited to persons. Obviously, you can apply it to animals, or you can apply, let's say, computers. For example, my computer, well, several devices inside my computer have a MAC address. So the MAC address uniquely identifies, unless something goes wrong, uniquely identifies my computer. So the MAC address would be actually a particular identification means. And of course we have many such means. We have something like license plates, car license plates that point exactly to a particular car, which would be another inverse functional property. Sometimes it could be that, well, this is sometimes the case that we have that we have properties that are both functional and inverse functional. Could you think of something like this?
Is national insurance involved?
If you think about the whole world, no, because I don't have one. I have a counterexample. One counterexample is sufficient. That's a good example. Yes.
Fingerprint?
Fingerprint is a good example. Yeah, even identical twins have different fingerprints, as far as I know. So yes, that's a very good example. Yeah, every person has one unique fingerprint, and every unique fingerprint has one unique person attached to it. Very good. Okay, so then we talk about classes, and we have already something to describe identical classes. How do we describe that two classes are identical? Well, this is me. I think you're right.
Three lines. Equal time and action.
Yeah, exactly. Equivalence to. Yeah, perfect. So we can talk about classes being the same. We can also say that two classes have nothing to do with each other. That means they don't have any overlap. Like here we have all these nice overlaps in this picture. Right? We could say that two of these circles are completely disjoint because they don't share any instance. And that's what disjoint class is about. So I could, for example, say that males are disjoint from females, at least with social gender. Biological gender sex is a bit difficult, but most countries social gender implies males and females are disjoint classes. Okay? There's no individual who belongs to both classes at the same time. We can, in numeric classes, we have this before description objects, the so-called nominals, where we say a class is defined by A and B and C. What is maybe a bit remarkable about this construct is that it behaves a bit differently than other class constructors. Other class constructors typically can extend afterwards. when I define a class to be ABC, I cannot later state this class also has B. Or if I say that, that actually means this B must be one of the three A, B, or C. So it must be merged. Right? I could say the class C is ABC, and I could then say the class C is also the same as D. Actually, an interesting question. Do you know the answer? What happens when I do both? Because I am allowed to do this. So I say class A, B, C, and then I say class equals D. What will happen?
D is the same as ABC, all of them.
Yeah, that's what I would expect. Exactly that. D is the same as A and B and C. They're all four the same. That's the only possible way out. I wonder whether the class definition would include that these are different elements, but I don't think so. Actually, I would have to check that. Yeah, so it's a closed set. And, well, we can also do this in OWL. Here's the construct, it's called OWL 1-off. So the continents are 1-off, Africa, Antarctica, Oceania, and so on and so forth. So this is, you see, just a different way of well, writing it down other than the mathematical notation. As I said before, you need to be able to read this. You don't need to be able to produce this particular OWL writing. You should be able to produce the mathematical notation.
Well, what would you call an enumerated? Well, it's not an enumerated set, but it's a kind of enumerated set that you could extend. Does that make sense? So say you might say there was an enumerated set which is closed with male and female, and now you say, well, that's not enough, you have to have a caching as well.
That's not possible.
It's not
You
enumerated.
you can no longer extend that. I mean, of course, you could say
Enumerated is something that you can extend, that's what I'm trying to say.
there's well, you could do. Well, it's a nice question. I like that. How would you do it?
So you have C being a subset of D by D, that's the new.
That would be one possibility. Absolutely, you could say, here I'm interested in a D, and this D is actually a superset of C, which implies that A, B, and C must be contained. Would be one possibility. Yeah, the other possibility would be that I directly describe that, for example, A is of RDF type D, and that, of course, establishes that this instance must be part of D, but I can add many more instances. Yeah, so the important part of these nominals is that it closes off the set. And that makes it different than if I just establish that something is an instance of a class. In OWL, I also have the possibility to say I want to include another ontology. So here's a very simple example. I have one ontology, well, let's say put somewhere on the web as a file, as an OWL file, and in that ontology I have the description B is the subclass of A, and then I define my second ontology, and in the second ontology I first say that ontology 2 imports ontology 1, and then I make another statement that C is a subclass of P. And if I do this import, it basically means I copy all the axioms that are defined in this first ontology into my second ontology. Right? It's really just like consider a copying act. It could even be that the first ontology itself imports other things. So you would even copy more than what we described there. And if you do this, that of course means you have both this axiom and the axiom of about D being a subclass of A. And if you take these two together, then you can, the reason I can derive the conclusion that C must be a subclass of A. So. A counterexample. If I have ontology 1 as before, 4 and ontology 3 does not have this import statement, then there's no reason in ontology 3 to conclude this axiom. Well, unless there are further axioms that are not listed here, but as it's written here, this axiom, C sub plus of A, could not be concluded by this. Because there would be just ontologies that live independently of each other, while the import says, I want you to reuse that. Okay, so that's already a lot of nice things we have in our 1. Then, that was recommended in 2004, so quite a while ago. And then people found that, well, there was a lot of research being done on our things that one previously thought would not be possible, one understood how they could be accomplished, and so quite a lot of new features were added to the OWL standard, and also the OWL languages were cleaned up. Again, you don't need to know exactly which construct is in which language. We will not go into this detail. I have another slide on complexity, and it's more for informing the computer scientists and not requiring this in the exam from the web scientists. But obviously we want to give these links. Okay, so what kind of additions do we have here? We have some syntactic sugar, some things that make it easier to express some things, some more expressiveness also, and some more data type support, so having the possibility to say something about natural numbers, for example. Some meta modeling, I'll come to that with an example so you understand what it means, and some possibility for annotation. So some syntactic sugar first. We already have the possibility to describe that a class is the disjunction of several classes, right? And that we also want to describe that any of these two classes, for example C1 and C2, are disjoint. It's very typical, actually quite often, when we do a class hierarchy, right, let's say we have here students, and then we want to have something like a science student, and here we have a humanities student, so a traditional picture would be that there would be a tree with the assumption that all of the instances would be in one of these branches, but never in two. Which need not be true in general, of course. Maybe web scientists define this notion exactly, which is what makes it so interesting. But let's assume we just will stick to the example now. It's a common pattern. We know this from biological taxonomy. You have mammals and reptiles, and there's nothing which is both mammal and a reptile, unless you go back in the history of evolution. And so you want to express that, well, there are all these many subclasses, and they're all supposed to be disjoint, and maybe even just for administrative purposes. And so there's now the possibility to express this, that you say, I have a description, so I describe a class, and I have here then a type, and I have here this interesting disjoint class definition, which is going to be a boy, girl, and I've added something else just to make it a bit more interesting. Boy, girl, and other, which would then mean I come back here with a description describing a class consisting of the union of these, at the same time asserting that boy and girl and other would be categories that don't share any instance. Because that's what class disjoint means. There will never be any instance that is in two of these classes at the same time. Okay. It is syntactic sugar, and why? Or do you even know the notion of syntactic sugar? Maybe I should have asked that first. Please ask these questions, because sometimes I just gloss over these expressions because I'm a computer scientist, and then this brings with you like 27 years of thinking, and then it's sometimes difficult to get rid of this all this package. So a syntactic sugar means that you don't need it really in the language, because the language, you can express everything you want to express without having this sugar. Like you can live from some food that doesn't have that sugar. That's nice. Tastes good to have it. Makes it more palatable sometimes. And so this syntactic sugar, like this one here, makes it convenient to write things down. But we could just, like on this previous slide, write it down by using these constructs, and then of course if you have n different classes, we would need to write n times n minus 1/2 many of these things that would explain individually that each pair is different. We had this already for the entities being different entities, right? There we had this already in our one. This was similar kind of syntactic sugar that you don't really need, but it's such a hassle to write down for, let's say, n being 10, that all of the 10 classes appear with disjoint. But it's very nice to have this syntactic sugar, even if you could live without. Something which is really adding to the expressiveness, not just syntactic sugar, is that you have a negative property assertion. What does it mean? Well, usually I would assert something like John has a child, Susan, right? And here basically you have the subject, the property, and the object. But in OWL, you also have the possibility to say a fact is not true. You say explicitly, yeah, this is not my child. And some people want to do that, definitely. So, why do we need that in OWL?
Imports. If you import something and you know I don't want to
No,
use
not
it.
really.
Pluto is not a planet anymore.
Why do we need this, really? Why don't we have that in a typical database? Sorry for those non-managed databases. Because of the open world assumption. Without having said that, and if you ask someone, is Susan the child of John? And if you have not asserted that, the reader would say, I don't know. Maybe it has fathered her, maybe not. But if you say that, then you give the reader the information, no, it's not true. You have established this is not the fact. And then the reader can draw its conclusions from there, from knowing that it's not true. So this is the big thing in description logic, the difference between not knowing and knowing that it is not the fact. And this is not common in the database world, because in the database you either say the fact is there in the database, and if it's not in the database, I assume it's not to be true. So in the database world, I would assume I know all father-child relationships. And if I don't know a father-child relationship, in the database world, I would assume then the person has not fathered the child. But in description logic, or in the semantic work, you would assume, well, we cannot know everything. There are so many facts out there in the web. How should we know if we not tomorrow learn about the fact that John is the father of Susan? And so we abstain from any particular vote until we are told it is the case or it is not the case, or unless we can infer it by some other means. Yeah, if we have an action that says each child can only have one father, and we know already that Susan has another father, then we would also infer that John cannot be the father of the child. So that would be, of course, an alternative way of asserting such a negative fact. Okay, so that's adding expressiveness. Self-restriction is adding expressiveness. So we can say on some property that we define a class if this applies to the individual itself. Let me give you this example. So here we define a class of narcissists, right? And here I define the narcissist, whether that's true, good definition, I'm not sure, but narcissist as being the class of all the people who love exactly one person, and that one person is themselves. Okay? So how can we do that? We simply say narcissist is an equivalent class, and here we have the intersection of, we talk about all the persons with this restriction, and this restriction has two things. It has the cardinality 1, so a person who loves only one person. This is where I'm not sure about how psychologists would define a narcissist, whether that could be higher than 1. So I made it, just restricted it to exactly what, and this has self describes, this is more like syntactic way to write it down, it's a bit verbose, I would say. It establishes that the instance has this property with itself. While in generality, the property that we talk about here, love, of course, is not necessarily reflexive. Yeah, you can hate yourself and love your friend. So general love is not reflexive, but here we talk about the class where this love involves the person and himself or herself. Okay? So the narcissist then loves exactly one person, which is him or herself. And as I said, this has self does not require a cardinality of 1. It could also be something, we could say something like psychologically healthy people are those who also love themselves, right? Then we would just maybe leave this cardinality away. And that's fine. You are allowed to love yourself and love some other people. And that's maybe quite healthy thing. Okay. The new construct, qualified cardinality. Sorry, I forgot something here. I did a mistake here when I changed it. This should be as now the extension went on the other side. I will correct this later in upload. So I want to express that there is a class that consists of all those instances that have 4 parts which are wheels. They can have other parts, but 4 of their parts are wheels. And that's what I will describe here. This has-part relationship has as a target this class wheel, and then I give a cardinality. In our 1, we could give this cardinality, but we could not describe that it must go to a particular class. Right? So, for example, let's describe a person. Well, say a healthy person would have 2 legs and 2 arms and 10 fingers. That's something you could all describe here. Right? And obviously, you could reuse this has-part relationship. So you would not have to make up different relationships like having fingers and then saying it's 10. Or you can always use the same has-part relationship to describe a person with 10 fingers and 2 legs and 2 arms and so on. And that also applies to data type properties. A new construct is also that we can say that a property is reflexive. The property same age as is reflexive because every instance has the same age as itself. I have the same age as myself. You have the same age as yourself. The question here I ask you when I tell you the story is, what is now the difference between reflexive property and the self-restriction with the narcissist we had before?
Is it with reflexive properties that don't exist, instances which don't satisfy it? So everybody has the same age as themselves, but not everybody has to love only themselves.
Yes. Well, your description is correct, but what is the general pattern that makes these two aspects different?
Everybody has the same age as themselves, but other people have the same age as them.
Yeah. But also with the narcissist, we could leave away the cardinality of one and say, let's say a psychologically healthy person loves him, herself, and other people. The difference is that this describes something about his property. I could indeed also say that, well, love is reflexive. That would of course mean that everyone who loves also him herself. It's a question whether I want to have that. Because, so this is about the property. The other, the narcissist example, was not about the property. It was about the class definition. So this is a restriction, and you know that every restriction defines a class. So obviously I could use here the last relationship, and the last relationship need not be reflexive. There could be people, as I said before, who don't love themselves. So this is also very tricky to understand sometimes. When do I describe something as a class? When do I use a restriction to define a class? Like even this red plot here is a class. It's a class without a name. It's a class defined by this restriction. And when do I define something as a property? And the properties have descriptions like reflexive, symmetric, and so on and so forth. And sometimes you can come up with the same conclusions by two different ways of modeling. Right? You could describe a property narcissist love, or something that would be reflexive or so. And you could come up with other ways of modeling what we have here. And then sometimes the question is, well, what is more natural? Right? Is it more natural to define a narcissist as having a particular usage of this love relationship, or is it more intrinsic to the property of love that it would be reflexive? In this case, I would say, no, it's not really intrinsic to love that this would be a reflexive relationship. I would rather include this have-self on the love relationship for the narcissist. But it's a modeling choice, and it's not always said that there's only one. Typically, the problem with modeling is that there are many different correct solutions. Some are more elegant, some are a bit absurd, but it's really the challenge that there is usually more than one possibility of doing something. Same age as is really, it's in the property that everyone has the same age as himself or herself. Then we have something called irreflexive properties. What does it mean? It means that strictly taller than, you cannot be strictly taller than yourself. It's impossible. You have a particular height, and strictly taller would imply you would have another height, and then it's just not possible, right? Or you cannot be married with yourself. At least I would not know any country where this would be possible, right? You have to come up with new rules, but I mean, there are probably some poets have
written novels or so where someone was married with himself or herself, but in general it's not really possible. Then we have asymmetric properties. That means if one direction holds, then the other does not hold. So the strictly taller than. Well, if you are strictly taller than me, it cannot be that I'm strictly taller than you at the same time. It's just not possible. Either one of us must be taller than the other, and then only one direction applies. Of course, in order to be asymmetric, that also that does not necessarily I use this strictly taller than as irreflexive, right? There are irreflexive properties like married with that are symmetric. If you are married with someone, then this person is also married with you. And so married with is irreflexive but symmetric, while strictly taller than is irreflexive and asymmetric. Then there's also a new construct, which is useful when you say you have properties of both.
You said the previous property, taller than, is asymmetric. Wouldn't it be better to say it's transitive?
Oh yes, it's transitive, absolutely.
Does being transitive mean you're asymmetric?
No. For example, I'm related to my sister, and she's related to me.
Sorry, did I wrong?
And I have two sisters actually, so I'm related to my one sister, the other, my older sister is related to my younger sister, and we're all related to each other, obviously. Right? So that would be an example for being transitive and symmetric. Of course, I might think of a special order relationships for which and strictly taller than special order relationships. Think of. Okay. Disjoint properties. Well, let's, for example, say we take the land mass of two countries, then they could be contiguous with each other. So let's say Ireland and UK would be contiguous because they share a common border. But then they cannot be spatially separated from each other. Having the one property excludes the other one. Or let's say if we take UK and Germany, they are separated from each other, they don't share a common border, so they cannot be contiguous. Right? So having the one property between two instances does not allow for the same two instances to have the other property. Yeah, and you can have more, like if something is close to something else, then it cannot be far from, and so on. Love, hates, well, sure, but depends what you want. But typically, you have antonymic relationships. Now, one property forbids having the same property, and another, a second property at the same time. Typically, antonymic relationships. Well, it's also handy, and so for property chain inclusion, how can we define an uncle? Well, an uncle could be described as, if I have an uncle, that means I have a parent, and that parent has a brother. Right? And so I can describe this property as uncle completely by the composition. So this circle in the middle is supposed to denote a composition, meaning when I write A has uncle C, then it means A has parent some B that I don't know, and this B has a brother C. So the composition means I go this path and I define this property by having these paths. Always be careful with the open world assumption. We could define that someone is my uncle, and I just might not know which entity is in the middle.
This is just a syntax to write this down, that the property has uncle is defined by such a chain accent, parent and brother. Keys are a new construct. We had already actually, again, the database people have an advantage because that's exactly what is done quite a lot all over the place in databases. Namely that you say, what is a property that identifies an entity of a class? We had this already. Which was it? Which construct?
Functional. Functional.
Almost?
Inverse functional.
Inverse functional, exactly. Now, the issue, of course, is sometimes there is not a single property that's sufficient. So before we have this single property, national insurance number, that's sufficient to identify someone. But it could be that that's not alone is not good enough. So, what you can do then is you can say several properties together are sufficient to identify a person. So, quite often what is done, you combine a name, let's say the birth date and the birthplace, and then it becomes very unlikely that this name with exactly this place and exactly this birth date is given to two different people. I'm not sure whether that would apply for Seoul and Korea. But let's say in England or Germany, I think that would work pretty well. Here the example is that there are two data type properties. Have social security number and have birth date that together would be considered a key. One of them alone would not be considered a key. And that's also what you can do in the database world, that you say two attributes together allow me to uniquely identify an instance. Here I can say that two properties, if I know two properties about an instance, then I can identify it uniquely. It's not limited to two properties. It could be 3 or 4 properties. It could even be all properties that this instance has. Yeah? And you would then know that if one of these two properties is different, it would be a different entity. Let us do this last slide of today. Next time we have to catch up with just like 1 or 2 subjects for our modeling. And we have the possibility to talk about data types. You know, data types in our we could refer to strings or integer, all these literals basically that we have in RDF, or a bit more actually, schema definitions are also allowed. But here I can go further in our tool and use a data type like integer, but then put additional constraints on it. I could, for example, say that the particular data type integer should, this one here, should start at a particular lower bound, like 5. I might define what is an adult. An adult is someone who has an age, and that's at least 18. That's something I can describe here. What is described here is a data type, which is an integer, but which the restriction that it must be minimum and including the number 5. So it would be all the numbers would be around 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on, but not 1, 2, 3, 4. And you have also similar limitations called upper bound, and so you can further restrict what you allow as a data type for these examples. Okay, so with that, let me conclude the presentation for today. I'm happy to take questions. No? Then, see you tomorrow. Have a nice day.